Well, welcome everyone. We are so excited to have you join us. My name is Amber Heffner. I am the Executive Director of the Illinois Digital Educators Alliance. And if you are just joining us, we're going to talk about some quick housekeeping items. Please, for now, keep your video off. It does just help with this large of a group on Zoom to have your video off and save on bandwidth. And please also make sure that you are muted. We would just want for our presenters to have their mics on, but everyone else should be muted for now. At the end of the session today, we will share the link for professional development hours. So we are excited to have an hour and a half today, and you will receive a link in the chat at the end of the session to receive those PDHs. Please note that the session today is being recorded. So the current recording is going. The good news about that is you will be receiving the recording, resources, and additional information in an email tomorrow. Also, we wanted to ensure that you are aware that there is live transcript available for this session. If you hover at the bottom of your screen, you will see where it says CC live transcript. And if you click on that button, you're able to choose show subtitles, and then you will have transcript during the session. Again, if you are just joining us, please make sure that you are muted, and please for now have your video off. And with that, I just again want to welcome you. We are excited and honored to host you today and offer this timely and very important workshop on culturally relevant teaching. And what a perfect day for us to share together on this very historic day in our nation. And with that, I would like to introduce Ben Gwynn, Director of K-12 Programs at EVERFI, and Jesse Bridges, Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at EVERFI. Ben and Jesse, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'll do a formal introduction to myself, and I'll pass it over to Jesse to introduce herself as well. My name is Ben Gwynn. I'm a former 8th grade English teacher. I always say that I only lasted 3 years in the classroom. I know how difficult of a job it is teaching, especially right now. So I just really want to thank all of you. I'll say as a former teacher, one thing that I always realized when I went to a lot of PDs, which will hopefully make this one a little bit different, is a lot of the times I would go and it was challenging to take what I learned to really be able to apply it in the classroom. So what's going to be different here is we're going to leave today with 3 things. One, you're going to get access to hours worth of student-driven, engaging, self-graded resources that are free and you can begin using tomorrow. Everything that we're talking about today is free. 2, you'll be provided with a number of activities, strategies, worksheets, resources that are more designed for direct instruction, whether you're virtual or in person. There's going to be a lot, but I'm going to share this presentation with you in the chat afterwards. Amber is going to send out a recording so you can look at it later for a refresher. The third thing is support. So I manage a team of people in Illinois. I'm based in St. Louis, but I help work with Illinois as well. And our primary responsibility is really to provide training and ongoing support for educators. So we're going to be able to connect with you afterwards individually with your school or your district, and kind of cover this content again for other trainings and resources. And again, this is all free. So that's just a brief background on myself and the purpose for this today. I'm going to pass it over to Jessie so she can introduce herself.
Well, hello, everyone. As Ben said, and as Amber said, my name is Jessie Bridges, and I serve as the Senior Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at EVERFI, and have the distinct pleasure and the honor of serving as what some qualify as an internal subject matter expert on topics of diversity, equity, inclusion, and culturally relevant teaching. I've been with the organization for a little over 1.5 years now. I started in August of 2019, but I've been in the education technology space for around 8 years now. Prior to that, spent about 10 years on college campuses, focusing on access and equity issues such as college program scholarship administration, as well as overseeing the Disability Services Office for a variety of students. You know, in my capacity, I have the distinct pleasure of working alongside folks like Ben on supporting districts and educators and administrators, providing critical life skills education that range from social emotional learning, core topics on diversity, equity, inclusion, and then some of those topics that are more equity based in nature to address, you know, systemic inequities, such as financial education or STEM readiness and STEM pipeline. And so I'm really excited to have a conversation with you all today. And I use that word very intentionally, about a dialogue and a conversation about best practices of culturally relevant teaching within the classroom, focusing on the core concepts of the value of diversity, equity, inclusion. And I'll stop and pause for just a moment to say thank you all for spending the time and carving out the space for us to have this conversation, for us to share knowledge and exchange ideas. It is not lost on us that this is a significant moment for our country, and that you all have decided to spend the time with us. Irrespective of where you fall in the political spectrum, today is a day where, you know, we're all coming together and having conversations about what does this mean and what does this mean for our students. And so that's where, you know, again, we're really appreciative and very grateful of the time that you decided to spend with us today. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ben.
Thanks, Jesse. The last thing I'll say, just as a matter of introductions, I just want to encourage everybody to be active and open and honest during our time together. Feel free to ask questions in the chat box and we'll address them either immediately if we can, or there'll be a Q&A opportunity afterwards as well. For those of you unfamiliar with EVERFI, we're just big picture, we're an education technology company and we create digital resources for schools. We started about 10 years ago, initially with the goal of addressing the need to provide financial literacy education to high school students with a digital program that we created. From there, we began to expand and now provide educators with resources that help address topics such as mental health, prevention education, STEM pathways, and what you're here for today, which are resources that cover topics pertaining to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then best practices in that area. So it's a little bit about who we are. For the agenda today, we're going to discuss the need for this training. We're going to set the stage of the framework for concepts related to equity, discuss culturally relevant teaching, how you can play an active role, go over our programs, then we'll provide you with access. So again, whether you're a teacher or an administrator, you're going to see how educators can sign up to use our online programs. We're going to answer questions throughout, and we'll be available for support afterwards. So the first thing I want to talk about is the need, and really that's like the main reason why we're here. So over the summer, we did we had a conference and we invited 4,000 educators that attended. We surveyed 400 of them, and we wanted to ask them questions about the topics that are difficult for them to address in the classroom, specifically in this area. In the survey, we found that 80% of the teachers reported diversity and inclusion as one of the most pressing topics that they wanted to address this year for the school year. 84% of the teachers said that teaching diversity and inclusion is a priority at their school. And then 87% said they feel unprepared to teach diversity and inclusion topics. So these stats show the need to teach it, but in addition, the need to provide training how to teach this. So we hope today that we can bridge this gap. And I also want to say it doesn't really end with the teachers though. So students are very socially conscious these days and want more of what they learn in school to relate to ways they can spark social change and education on topics related to race, gender, identity, etc. I grew up in New York City, and I look at the article in the bottom right, which highlights that while New York City is a very diverse place, the admission and selection policies for the public school system there actually has resulted in the district being very segregated. So the need and demand to raise awareness about these topics is important for the teachers, but it's coming from the students as well. And when thinking about why it's really relevant for students, with teachers and students wanting more information around these topics, how do we educate them? But do so in a way that's going to empower them with 21st century workplace skills, regardless of the pathway they select. After high school, the students that you're working with today are going to interact with people that have both different and opposing ideas. They're going to be faced with challenges and work with groups than they've ever worked with before. They're going to have to work collaboratively in an environment like this. And that's a skill that's really imperative to teach the students so they can develop those skills now. So we're going to talk about all this through the lens of providing students with these skills to prepare themselves for a 21st century workforce. I'm going to pass it over to Jesse, who's going to lead us through some activities, and it's going to be very interactive. So hopefully you're all engaged and ready to participate.
Thanks, Ben. And so, with that overview in place, that teaching towards diversity and inclusion education and those core topics really being positioned, and I would say reframed, as a 21st century workforce skill. I'll just focus on that for just another moment. Part of how I spend my time is working alongside our product team on developing training solutions. These are digital, scalable training solutions, not only for students in the K-12 setting, but also for students on college campuses, as well as employees in the workplace. And what we're hearing a lot from employers is that when students graduate from high school, they have a few different routes. They could be going on to a college campus, whether that's a 2-year campus or a 4-year campus, a technical college, or some other form of higher education. They could be going into the military. They can be going directly into the workforce. Regardless of where their journey takes them next, what they are saying, what employers and college campuses are saying is that they need students to be able to collaborate across differences, to be able to see and sit with someone else's perspective as they go throughout life and they work on projects together, or they're on teams together, or they're developing some sort of academic research together. The ability to be able to be emotionally intelligent or emotionally cognizant, as well as being able to collaborate when someone has an alternate perspective than you do, that is being positioned really much as a competency, a leadership competency, but a core competency as students are developing into conscientious citizens. And so we thought that a good use of time is for us to take a step back and really kind of center ourselves on the definitions that we see swirling around. And there are a variety of them, but there are 3 key terms as we talk about culturally relevant teaching. The first is diversity, the second is inclusion, and then we'll also focus on the term equity. These are relevant topics, they're hot button issues, but I would also say that they're evergreen in terms of how you manage and create the conditions of learning and psychological safety within your classroom. And so we'll start first, as we can advance the slide forward, Ben, on the term diversity. And so what I did was I wrote the definition up top, but I thought it would be more interesting to see an exercise in the applicability of why diversity is important. I think conceptually, most people that I come across would say fundamentally and conceptually, I agree. Philosophically, diversity is important. But when the rubber meets the road, when you really start to apply this terminology and what does it look like in a workplace setting or a school setting, why does it become important? And so, as you see reflected up top, the definition is essentially the similarities and differences among people. That can be a lot of things. Oftentimes, we center that on the physical traits and attributes that people own and carry, and we can assess about them visually for the very first time. But there's so many layers and such a multifaceted nature to what we mean by diversity. And so I thought, again, the example, and I'm coming from the education technology world, so I can get a little bit nerdy about all things technology, sometimes to a modicum, that I thought it'd be helpful to use this exercise. You see a couple of logos here that I think you all are pretty familiar with. One is Apple in the form of an iPhone. The other is the icon that focuses on, or that is symbolic of YouTube. And so I'll tell you a little bit of a story, and then I'll ask you all some questions, and hopefully you'll engage in the chat. Is that when the iPhone, when apps became really popular, and we were downsizing what we saw on a computer screen down to that of the size of the iPhone, apps became very popular. And so there was a move by YouTube to create the application of YouTube, as opposed to logging into a site that you see on a computer screen. And so in the development of the YouTube app, there were a series of what we call sprints in the development world. It's you take kind of chunks of capabilities and you put them along a timeline. You develop them with, front end and back end developers, and you kind of put it out into the app store, the app world. And so when the YouTube app was released on the iPhone or the App Store, what they were noticing, and they were getting consistent feedback, was that 5 to 10% of the initial user population were seeing their YouTube videos upside down pretty consistently. And no one could necessarily figure out why 5 to 10% of the population wasn't able to see the videos right side up. So if I were to pause for a minute and invite you all to guess, why would you say this 5 to 10% of the population were seeing their YouTube videos upside down? You all have not been shy in the chat as we got started in the intro, so I'd invite you all now. Throw out, there are no wrong answers. And here they come. Oh, goodness. I see older versions, screens were locked, possibly having learning disabilities, holding their phone differently. And I do see a couple of people who have named it accurately, that the folks who were seeing their YouTube videos upside down were those folks who were left-hand dominant. I am one who is I think it's called Southpaw. Is it called Southpaw, Ben? So I'm a Southpaw. I'm a person who in, the large lecture class in college was kind of shoving myself into the right-hand desk and trying to get it right. But these were individuals who were left-hand dominant. And so they were using the phone in that way. But if we bring that back to why, how do you think that we got to a place where it completely missed, the developers completely missed that they needed to accommodate for left-hand users? How do you think they got to that place? How did they kind of miss that capability, that functionality, and that user experience? Go ahead and enter in your ideas in the chat. They were all right-handed. That's exactly. I don't know who S. Rufo is, but you nailed it. There was not one person on the team, not a front-end developer, not a back-end developer, not a UX designer, not a marketer, not one person on the team who was developing this capability and on a dominant basis. And so that's where we come back to the idea of why diversity, why representation, why alternative perspectives are remarkably important in your environments. When you have that lack of representation, when you have that lack of perspective and opinion and experience, you're prone to miss some things in what you're trying to create, whatever the goal is. It can be a program, it can be a product, it could be a lesson plan, it could be a service. When you're not accounting for all of the ways that people are going to use whatever it is you create or the environment that you're creating, you're prone to miss some things. And that was a lesson for YouTube, the YouTube developer users, that they had to think more holistically and be more representative of how they, one, comprised their teams, but then also how they ran through their user experience testing, because they thought, okay, well, we just have a group of people who are using it internally, but if you're all using it in the same way, well, then it doesn't account for the 5 to 10% of the people or the 20% of the population that is going to be what we call kind of an edge case, if you will. So that really is the value proposition or the business case, if you will, on why representation is so important in how we design things. And again, those can be programs, services, lesson plans, whatever it is, it has to be looked at through a multidimensional lens. Let's move on to the kind of core definition of what we mean when we talk about inclusion. And I'm going to give you another visual example. If we could move on to the next slide, Ben. Really, on the left-hand side of the screen, you're going to see what inclusion means. It's an atmosphere where people feel like they belong, where they contribute, where they can thrive. And the second part of that is that it has to be intentional, it has to be deliberate. Inclusion doesn't happen on accident. It has to happen by design. The visual that you're seeing on the right-hand side of your slide, let me give you some context, is that this was an ad that was released in 2003, 2004 or so. It has become the lore of business school case studies for a lot of reasons. Now, I'm going to describe the visual. So you have in the center of the room, you have a man who I assume identifies as white. And he's standing in the middle of the room. He's dressed in business casual wear. On either side of him, you have individuals who are in a bowed position, who are wearing athletic gear. who you can't necessarily see their faces, but we have some things going on in the chat now. I want to hear your visceral reactions to what you're picking up on. I've already seen some people say, OMG, who let this get past marketing? But just give me your visceral reactions of what are you picking up on here and what are you seeing? They always miss these things. Tell me more. Looks like he's bossy, latent racism, they're in a track stance, not bowing, it's a horse race, privilege, employees are the same, there are copies. There are lots of things. Runners look like they're bowing, looks like a racist statement. There's a lot that we pick up on that is subliminal, that's not stated. These aren't words on the page. Okay, so let's pause for a second. What are we advertising here? Speed of service, computers, facet. That took a little bit longer. I felt that pause in the chat when I asked you, what are we actually advertising here? And typically, it takes people a while to get to the place that it's about the Intel Core Duo 2 processors, the speed and the performance of it. Oftentimes, people will get hung up in the subliminal message behind this. You pick up on the concepts of power and privilege and oppression and systemic racism, and why are they faceless and why aren't there any women? There are lots of things to be said about this that have nothing to do with what they were actually trying to advertise. So where this fell apart and what this has to do with inclusion, some would say, and if I ask the diagnostic, why? How did we get to the place that someone asked earlier in the chat, how did this get to market? It's a great question. And instantaneously, I oftentimes get reactions that, oh, well, there couldn't have been people of color who were part of the marketing executive team that let this get passed. It clearly wasn't a representative team. Where this becomes, again, lore in business case studies and business school case studies is that actually it was quite a representative team. There was a lot of racial diversity. There was gender diversity on this team. Howsoever, the marketing agency that put this together was so toxic that people felt they had to be silenced, that they had no sense of inclusion, that they had a perspective, but they weren't able to put it on the table, if you will, or amplify it in any way because they didn't feel safe doing so. And so as we talk about concepts of diversity and inclusion, representation is part of the issue to solving, gaps and those type of things. But then it's also when you're talking about the conditions that you create in a classroom for people to share their perspectives, for students to give voice to their opinions, you have to have that yes and. Exactly, Dion. It can be the same way for students. When they don't feel safe sharing and providing their perspective, they're going to go back out of those conversations. And then you've got this kind of homogenous view of what's acceptable and what's okay and what the social norms are. And so that's where the importance of inclusion comes to the center of this conversation, that it's not enough to create the conditions of representation and making sure that you diversify your teams and your school projects, but also, are you creating those intentional acts, those deliberate acts of inclusion so that people feel that they can speak up, that the differentiated perspective that they bring to the table is valued. And so, in that, there's work to be done about how you stand up and come and are present as an educator. There's also, how do you work from student to student interactions that I'm seeing also in the chat as well. And so, that's what we're also talk about, but conceptually, looking at the applicability of what does it take to create the conditions of civility, of respect, of healthy and productive dialogue. Inclusion is an important ingredient to that. And we can also now move on to, there's a concept, and I think for a long time people held the idea of diversity being important, and then we evolved and said diversity and inclusion is important. And another concept that has come to light more recently, but I would say has been, kind of talked about, especially in the summer of last year, is the idea of equity. And so if we can move on to the next slide, Ben. Even, in that, there's a visual now, and so I guess in operational terms, equity, as you see in the definition on the right, can be defined as the absence of disparities that are systemically associated with social advantage or disadvantage. The idea of equity and the idea of privilege, as you all are aware, and there's been a lot of narrative and rhetoric, especially at the end of last year, about teaching how identity intersects with ideas of equity and privilege and systemic inequity, if you will. And so I like the visual on the right-hand side of the screen to kind of differentiate when we talk about equity and we talk about equality, what are the differences and why is one better than the other, or how are they different from each other? So on the left-hand side of the visual, you see 3 individuals. Each one of them is given a box to see over a fence into what feels like a sporting event. I'm going to call it soccer. I'm not really sure if it's soccer or not. So each individual is given a box to stand and see over the fence. The individual on the left is given one box who's taller in stature. The individual in the middle is also given a box who's shorter in stature. And then the third person on the right is given a box, but is in a wheelchair, and so isn't able to leverage that box whatsoever. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see an alternative, which is, I think, closer to a version of equity, but I would probably create a third picture. On the right, you see the taller individual on the left who's not given a box at all because they're able to see over the fence just fine. The individual in the middle is given 2 boxes to be able to adequately see over the fence. And then the third individual is given a ramp as opposed to a box at all to meet the needs of their circumstance. Again, I think this is a fairly decent interpretation of what we mean by equity. People are given the resources and supports that they need based on the conditions and circumstances in which they find themselves historically, systemically. I think if I were to redo or maybe add a third image to this, it would be taking down the fence altogether, which is what I see some folks saying in the chat. The question then becomes, why is there a fence altogether? And or what if these individuals actually want to be players on the field or fans in the stand, as opposed to passive bystanders or spectators behind the fence? And so when we get to true definitions of equity, we're talking about removing systemic barriers and then providing and empowering and enabling individuals with the supports and the resources they need to be able to equitably access and engage in the opportunities that are presented to them. And so again, I thought that as a form of exercise and ground setting, having those core concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion as we talk about creating culturally relevant spaces of learning would be helpful just as table setting exercises. So I'm going to pause talking for a minute. I'm going to check the chat and see what you all are saying. The last thing that I see, and I apologize for everything that I missed before, that is equity is different from equality in the sense that equity ensures that people are given the supports needed with respect to their given circumstances. Yes. And every time we take down a fence, someone will build another. That's why we always need equity. Yes. And some people see that as a progression or ascension. First you work on equity, then you can work on equality. I think there are concurrent streams. In that way, I think it's important for us to always keep an eye on what is the moment in time need to be met. As an example, diversity and inclusion education, being able to teach that interpersonal skill set is the acute need that we hear a lot of educators asking for now. But we're not going to take our eye off of the goal that there are those critical life skills, those cultural competencies, that cultural capital that I, as myself, wasn't necessarily given as I was growing up. I had no idea what a checking account was when I was growing up. I was an individual who attended a 4-year college, did not know what a FAFSA was until my sophomore year. And so those are the equity-based education skills that we're also not taking our eye off of when it comes to really creating that system and the ecosystem of equity and opportunity. And so with that, I just want to take a quick spot on a framework that you all might be familiar with, and then we can move on to the next slide, and really thinking about, where does that sit in the larger context? And I am not a public health professional. I am a mental health counselor by training and trade. But there is a public health framework that I really appreciate in this context of the conversation called the social determinants of health. And in this framework, which again is a public health framework, it really looks at what are the disparities and the social determinants to health outcomes and life outcomes for people based on really kind of 6 core principles of economic stability, as you see reflected, neighborhood and physical environment. Where are our students going to school? What do they have access to in terms of play? And how does that manifest in the physical wellness of individuals? Certainly education, literacy gaps, vocational training, access to higher education, and then also food stability. What we have seen throughout this pandemic, and you all know it well, is how vulnerable food insecurity and food stability are for some of our students, having access to healthy options, if you will. And then also in the community and social context, what do those systems of support look like? What does community engagement look like? In some ways, you could turn this on its side and almost look at it as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but really like what are the pillars of influence to health and life outcomes? And then ultimately it lands on the healthcare system and how do you navigate appropriately the healthcare system? How do you get access to healthcare and those types of things? And then you see along the bottom the health outcomes that are influenced by these 6 pillars of the focus in the social determinants of health: mortality, mobility, life expectancy. We continue to see these disparities, and it's a multifaceted, complex issue that's knitted together by years of systemic inequity, but then also some of the conditions that we currently find ourselves in. And so that informs, all that we talk about in the conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion, but then also how it specifically impacts the conversations that are happening in your classroom. And so there's one place where I feel really passionately, given my background and experience, where this comes to a point, and there's a point of confluence, and we can move on to the next slide, Ben, and really focusing on how that impacts the thought process around mental well-being. And there's a conversation about what equitable mental well-being looks like. And so can we talk about when you all consider the term equitable support, what does that look like to you? What would equitable support for the students in your classroom, provided by your school, provided by your district, what would that look like? And I see here reflected, Dion, thank you for your comment. It makes you reflect on your privilege and being mindful of students in their daily lives. And Chris says that students are getting what they need, that it's dependent on the child's needs. Thank you, Lisa. And oh, it's moving fast, which is good. The students and teachers get the support that they need for students to be successful. The supplies that we're challenging the status quo, giving students access to the support, student-centered and teacher support. I think that's really powerful. Students getting what they need to live a long life. Varied multiple supports based on individual needs. That's exactly right. All of these go into how do you create individualized support according to needs. And all of that, when you talk about equitable support, as opposed to giving everybody kind of the same pencil when you actually need one that's a little bit smaller, you need assistive technology because you're not using a pencil at all. It really is focusing on what are the customized need for each student, and how do we do that at scale? And that's one of the questions that I think we've grappled with for years and ages, is how do I create that differentiated instruction or system of support based on a student's need? And I'm but one teacher, and how do I do that in my classroom? And so we can click through, Ben. And we also, we talk about that, and I talked a little bit about, equitable mental well-being. There were lots of conversations that happened last year that were spurred on by the pandemic, and there was a deeper exploration of I would say the symphony of crises that we were experiencing that were spurred on the pandemic. Is certainly financial, but it also shined a glaring light on the disparities in our healthcare system, particularly when it came to providing mental health support for students from underrepresented backgrounds. And you'll see here, we take the idea and the concept of mental well-being or mental health services, and then you start to unpack that in terms of what it needs and being culturally responsive to a student's condition. I like this visual, and I'll describe it, really quickly, is that when you talk about mental health, there's the top layer of the medical model of mental health and seeing diagnoses, and having the kind of diagnostic codes, if you will. But then you start to unpack that and you unravel it, and you see that it's, again, really intersectional and multi-layered. It's multidimensional. It's informed by things like racial battle fatigue or historic inequality and inequity. It's, it's looked at through the lens of racism or mass incarceration. And so really you start to unpack what does equitable mental health look like? That it is, as Michelle is saying, it's very misunderstood. How do we position it so it's destigmatized? That it's, socially normed to be able to reach out and provide mindfulness care or those types of things. But again, it's not a simple concept. It's not necessarily a matter of I've identified a need, I go to a counselor or a therapist, and I seek the services that are needed. There's much more, and we have to recognize when we're creating culturally responsive spaces that the barriers for each of the individuals that we're trying to support could be remarkably different. And it's our work not only to understand that, but also to understand, what are the supports that are available to us, and what's the work that and the reflection that we need to do so that we're able to pick up on and expand the aperture of that awareness. And so with that, I'll pause there. I really appreciate all of the engagement in the chat. Dion, yes, I also love this visual. It's by an artist that I came across on Instagram called, her name is Elise Rani. And so if you all are interested, we can probably link that post in the chat for you all. It's one that I kind of consistently keep in the front of my mind, so that I always, hold to be true that these concepts and content is deeper and deserves a lot of thoughtfulness and intention. And so as we take it from that 30,000 foot layer of, conceptually, what do we mean when we say diversity, equity, inclusion? What do we mean when we talk about systems of inequity? And then apply that to culturally relevant teaching in your classroom. I'm now going to turn it back over to Ben.
Great, thanks. So what is culturally relevant teaching? I am so enthusiastic, just like looking at everybody's responses, engagement. It seems like this is something that is a topic and a huge priority, and something you're having conversations with about with your students already. So that's just incredible. Really, for the next couple slides, I'm just going to go over some key definitions and an overview of what culturally relevant teaching is, and some ways you can apply some of the strategies in your classroom, and also just reflect on yourself for what you're maybe doing now, and to whether you're meeting the mark for having this as a part of your classroom. So what is culturally relevant teaching? It's a phrase coined by Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. It consists of 3 fundamental pillars. One is holding high academic expectations for students. Another is making sure that you're going to demonstrate cultural competencies. So that means understanding that their own worldview and understandings may or may not align with those of other students. And that ties back to what Jesse and I were referencing earlier in regards to after high school, or even now, other people that they're interacting with might not have those viewpoints. So how do you self-reflect on those? And the third is making sure students are socio-politically aware, making sure they have a willingness to acknowledge and critique inequity. I saw a lot of that in the chat and in conversations around equity versus equality, and something really important to talk about with your students. And it's really important, the last point is that these 3 best practices are codependent on one another to effectively have culturally relevant teaching in your classroom. Why is it important for you all? So it's going to really strengthen the student's sense of identity. It will help promote equity and unity in the classroom. It also engages students in the course material that you're teaching, and supports critical thinking. So it's really important because it's going to help meet the diverse needs of students from various backgrounds, and not to mention just various learning styles. This has become a top priority for educators. You can't just teach one way, as you all know. You have to meet students at different reading grade levels, and making sure that you're being cognizant of different identities as well. There's going to be hyperlinks throughout the presentation. I'm going to share the deck towards the end, and it will be sent out, but there's hyperlinks embedded into the presentation. So that will provide further reading and resources pertaining to the topics that we're presenting on. So here I've outlined 5 steps to becoming a culturally responsive teacher. They are just in order: assessing your own behavior, getting to know your students, making your classroom a judgment-free zone, adapting your teaching practices to be inclusive for all students, and then ensure your lessons incorporate multicultural information and approaches whenever possible. There's supporting documents on this slide to help with these strategies for all 5 of the steps. They're going to include tips on how you can be proactive when it comes to learning about the different cultural backgrounds of your students in the classroom, or ways to assess your own behavior by recognizing that your own cultural influences and attitudes, and how that impacts your teaching style. There's also going to be a link to 5 culturally relevant teaching strategies. So the previous slide discussed steps that you can take to become a more culturally responsive teacher, almost more as a point of reflection. Here are some strategies that you can directly use with your students in the classroom, though. One of them being an English teacher, a former English teacher, I should say, one that I found was really important, is to take an inventory of your classroom. So thinking about Having a diverse collection of books can really support all students and finding titles that they can read and connect with on some level, while affirming their own cultural identities and hopefully developing important positive insights about others as well. This is going to provide students with books and diverse characters. This serves as a mirror into, lets them serve as a mirror into, or a window into the books that we read. So this is really helpful for them. Another step you can do is to make like learning contextual. So the link provided here directs you to a framework for anti-bias education. So again, all of these strategies are explained in short here, but then there's corresponding links that are provided that will help you, practice this in further detail. I'm going to pass it back to Jesse just to address how to play an active role in the conversation when it comes to these topic areas.
Thanks, Ben. So I think, the first step in creating the conditions for culturally responsive and culturally relevant teaching is this idea of self-exploration. And, as a person who has been in a practitioner role and has facilitated at this point, thousands of learning experiences on diversity education, one concept that I consistently come back to as evergreen and necessary in this conversation is the idea of identity. We talk about diversity, and oftentimes that term is really codified too narrowly to talk about race and ethnicity, sometimes gender, and really, again, centering on those physical attributes that we carry that you can assess for the first time when you meet someone. But the idea of identity and how that informs your approach, what you see, what you don't see, your preferences, your favorabilities, all of that is kind of the core foundation and the cornerstone of creating a culturally responsive classroom. And so I thought, if you all are willing, all 359 of us are willing to engage in a bit of an exercise of self-exploration together, I'd love to just guide us for the next few moments to talk about identity, and recognizing that as, again, multifaceted and intersectional. There's a concept of intersectionality that was first created by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. I believe it was in the 1980s, and has come kind of full focus as we talk about and have conversations about racial equity. And then how do you, also look at that and recognize the confluence of gender equity. And a lot of times I have these conversations in workplace when we talk about pay equity and disaggregating that by different characteristics. But again, it's really important to consider who you are, how you show up, the identities that you carry, and the identities that you carry that are evolving over time. And so if you all will engage me for a moment, let me first explain the graphic or the visual that you're seeing in front of you. This was developed in 2015 by the consulting firm Korn Ferry Miller. And they use it as a visual to really explain diversity as a multidimensional concept. Again, I think when we talk about diversity, and I have a lot of conversations in workplaces, and so oftentimes I'll do consulting work that focuses on a candidate pipeline and who you're bringing into the organization, and they'll say, I want diverse candidates, and I'll say, diverse in what way? And they'll say, diverse, and I'll say, diverse in what way? And getting people to the place where it's comfortable to say, we're talking about racial diversity. And when we talk about racial diversity, we're very specifically talking about individuals who identify as Black or African American. That level of specificity is important because it informs, again, individually who we are, but then also the communities that we're attempting to support. And so we start with, on my right-hand side, that yellow box of physical attributes. That's what you can pick up on about a person, or that you can assume about a person when you meet for the first time. Those physical attributes, and oftentimes you can kind of assess people's age. You can assume sort of their racial or their gender identity and see some of their physical attributes. But diversity and identity carries so much more weight. Oftentimes I've seen this visualized as an iceberg, if you will, and the physical attributes are the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much more below the waterline. And so getting below that waterline, walking around the wheel, going counterclockwise, you've got cognitive diversity, how we think, how we process information. This becomes remarkably important when you're talking about learning styles in the classroom, but it also talks about how you engage students in the classroom. Something that I tell people kind of in the first 5 minutes that they meet me as a person, and I don't know why this has been my fun fact to share, but I'm an introvert posing as an extrovert. My job requires that I'm in a very extroverted capacity. I'm presenting to people all the time, but I've also learned myself well enough to know that I can't do 3 back-to-back learning experiences, because by the time, if I start out giving an A+ to the first group, by the time I get to the third group, they're going to get a C- because I've expended all of my energy into a group of people. And so being a person who's an introvert posing as an extrovert, or an introvert in an extroverted capacity, you know, that's something that I'm attuned to, especially as I think about students in a classroom and who's willing to kind of be the most gregarious person in the class, raise their hand first, be the person who's speaking the loudest and the most often. And are we missing the contributions of the person who's taking a little more time to codify and distill their process, or maybe would really give you a very thoughtful written response as opposed to a spoken response? And can we be nimble and agile in how we create our learning environments to accommodate for those different types of learning styles? You know, what is the emotional quotient of people? And then we move into relational diversity, how we relate to, how we rejuvenate. You know, what are our community, if we go back to that framework of the social determinants of health, what does our community engagement system and network of support look like? What's our family status? I became a mother, you know, 10 years ago when I got married to my husband, who has a daughter. And so I became a mother in some capacity at that point in time. And blended family is something that is complex and interesting. And then I birthed a child 6 years ago. And that family status, that parental status, completely changed who I was as an employee, as a professional. And so those relational dynamics change and evolve over time, and they contribute to who we are, what we prioritize, what we think is important and not. But then also it shapes our habits, our personal behaviors, the kind of idiosyncrasies of who we bring to the table. And then we have occupational diversity. You might be an educator. You might be someone who's in the classroom. You could be a teacher's aide. You could be an administrator. You could be the school nurse. And though you are all working in the same physical or virtual building at this point, how you do that work and the work that you do provides occupational diversity. And what you think about in terms of, you know, what is important in the care and the wellness and the development of students is going to be slightly tweaked based on your role and responsibility within the organization. And then we've got societal, you know, how we connect to and relate to society. And these create really interesting conversations. I will underscore, you know, the political conversations, and there was a study recently, earlier last year, around political conversations and influencing workplace dynamics. And it was 43% of people who were surveyed were having political conversations about the election in the workplace, and they were actually rupturing, kind of creating a little bit of rug burn in workplace dynamics. And so we bring all of that into our workplace. It informs how we see the world, how we move about society, and the relationships that we strike that feel natural and those that don't. And then finally, this is not exhaustive or comprehensive, but we have the values of what we believe, our practices, our convictions that are informed by a lot of things, whether that be an origin of faith or where we grew up culturally. All of our value sets and our beliefs and our habits, we carry those. And whether or not we think so, we kind of place those expectations on other people. And what does work ethic look like? You know, we have a definition of that that's informed by our values. And so when we compare that to someone who has a different, you know, determination of what work ethic means, we could say that's wrong or right. We're assigning a value to that. So now that we've explained it and gone on about it, you know, ad nauseum, what I would like to do and invite you all to do now, if we can move on to the next slide, Ben, is to take some time to reflect. And what I would like you to reflect on, and if you're, you know, so moved, I would like to actually invite you to use pen and paper or a writing utensil, or maybe your computer, or maybe just kind of reflect cognitively on who you are and what you bring to the table. What are the identities that you carry that are important to you? What you're seeing reflected in the slide now is a visual to help guide this exercise. In the middle, you'll see a circle. And, you know, if you're invited to bring out some pen and paper now and recreate this visual on your paper or on your writing device, there's a circle in the center, and radiating out from that circle are 6 concentric circles. You think of it as a 6-legged spider, if you will. So there's a circle in the center. There are 6 lines radiating out of that. And at the end of each of those lines is another circle. what I would like for you to do is to, in that center circle, write your name. And that can be your first name, last name, childhood nickname. If you do use your childhood nickname, we do require that you put it into the chat. And in those circles that are radiating out of the center circle, I'm going to bring back up the visual of the identity wheel that we talked about a little bit earlier. And what I would like for you to do, and I do recognize that the print is a little bit small, so I apologize for that. So if you can zoom in and get closer to your screen, what I would like for you to do is take that visual of who you are at the center and what are the identities that you carry that are important to you. And I would say generally important to you, but then also you could consider how are they important to you in the work that you do. So I told you all a little bit about myself. If I were to fill out my circle, and I've done this a few times, so I have an unfair advantage, I would say one of the circles would be that I'm an introvert posing as an extrovert, that I'm a parent. I would also list that I am a woman of color, and I would actually put woman and person of color, a biracial person, in those as well. Then I'd also say that for me, I'm in Western. I was born in Columbus, Ohio. I was raised in Los Angeles, and I moved back to Ohio. So it gives me this really kind of interesting, funky Western, Midwestern vibe. But I also live in the DC metro area now. And if you all know anything about the DC metro area, before the days of the pandemic, people would take the metro a lot. I was the person on the metro who was looking people in the eye. I was greeting people. I was speaking to folks. I was holding the metro door open. Consider it kind of like a light version of a New Yorker in a very stereotypical sense. That was not welcomed. It was not appreciated, but that's a core value of who I am. Lots of people describe me as approachable, and it, I think, makes me pretty effective in my work, but it's a part of, kind of the societal and value places that come together for me. And so, those are the characteristics, the identities that I carry as I go into the world, as I interact with people, as I cultivate groups. And so I want to invite you all to sort of reflect on who you are, what's important to you, what are the identities that you carry, and then start to consider how do they inform your work. So I'm actually going to be quiet and put myself on pause for about 2 minutes to give you all the time to reflect and to jot some notes down, and then we'll come back together and kind of, I'll pose a couple of questions in the chat before we move on. So I'm going to go on mute now unless there are any questions about the exercise, and I'll check the chat now just to see if the instructions are clear. I'm going to take that as everybody's got their orders. All right, I'll be quiet for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back and I'll post some questions in the chat.
Yeah, can you see the bubble slide again? Sure, I'm going to jump back to that.
Sally, that is technologically fancy to take a screenshot and write on it.
I'll jump back to the other slide in a second that has everything else listed out.
Felicia, no, you don't need to use a sentence frame. We'll get to that in a moment, but just feel free to, in the bubbles, write down the identities, and you can use more than 6, you can use less than 6. Don't feel constrained either to the bullet points that you see here.
Jesse, that's a good question from Azra. Hopefully I pronounced the name right. I'm going to look online for like a document that has that, so you can write in it, something that you can print out. I'll look for that and add that to the page.
Yeah. Ben, there is, if you Google circles of my multicultural self, that exercise should pop up.
Got it. I'm going to put the link in so when I share the presentation, you'll have that.
I will post office hours, and then I will, Jay Gillespie, I will expect it. Can we do March instead of April? Is that okay?
Azra, I'm going to put the links into the presentation. Sorry, I'm going to make sure you have that though.
Yes, they can include positive things, things that you don't like. I'm seeing Katie there. Really, you know, we won't necessarily share all of these in the chat, so feel free to be as candid with yourself as you would like.
Quick question, when does the session end? I think we're slated to go until 5 p.m. Central Time. Yeah.
I can't believe somebody just asked that question.
It was just from a time perspective. No worries. Jesse, do you have the question prompts you're going to add in?
Say that again, Ben.
You have the question, were there question prompts you were going to add for the next steps for this?
Yes. So I think we're going to wrap up on the reflective part of the exercise. And then Ben, if you can go back one slide to the bubbles in the circle. While we're not going to do this part of the exercise right now, for time's sake, one thing that I would invite you to do is to use the prompt that you see here, the I am, but I am not, as a perspective taking exercise. And this is something that is really important to culturally relevant teaching and race equity teaching, is the idea of perspective taking. Can I put myself in the shoes of another person's experience and using the identity? So say, for example, that you listed Christian as one of your identities. That is your faith practice. What you would do with this exercise is list, I am Christian. That is your faith origin, but I am not. And then consider, what are some of the harmful stereotypes about that faith practice that you can imagine someone who is not of that faith practice might say about you or assume about you? And use any one of the identifiers that you can. But what this does is really kind of get you in the mindset of alternative perspectives. And how can you, and I've actually had a lot of educators use this with students to talk about stereotypes and assumptions that we make about people. And so using that exercise of I'm an introvert, but I'm not quiet. I am a mother, but I'm not a helicopter parent. You know, those kind of things breed really interesting discussions that, oh, I like that, Michelle. I'm flexible, but I'm not rigid. And take those parts of your identity, which actually, you know, kudos to you all who have done the exercise. This is really difficult to do for the first time, to really kind of dissect yourself into buckets and portions in ways that you haven't necessarily explored before. Some people have done exercises like this. They've taken this time, but for people who are kind of diving in for the first time, I appreciate your candor and your willingness to engage. And so that is a part of the exercise. But the question that I wanted to pose to you all is, what was this exercise like for you? You don't need to disclose the identities that you wrote down, but this reflective exercise of sitting back and thinking about what identities inform your experience beyond the creation of the PDF or the Google slide. What was this exercise like for you? Katie says it was eye-opening. And I'd like to invite others into talking about what this experience was like. I see that it helps boost confidence, self-respect, the discussion surrounding transgender populations and cisgender students, very self-reflective. It makes you become aware really quickly, see positive aspects about yourself. Admitting vulnerability is a big one. Sitting with and kind of being mindful, intentional about discovering who you are is not a luxury that we oftentimes afford ourselves. We don't sit around, because we're all remarkably busy people. We don't necessarily sit around considering, who am I and what do I bring to the table and what are my perspectives? But creating that space to do so can actually help expand your aperture on, well, what am I naturally drawn to? If I'm a gregarious individual who's really extroverted, my tendencies and my preferences would think, oh, well, the students who reflect my behavior who mirror who I am, I'm going to be naturally drawn to. And my work as a culturally relevant teacher is to also attend to those students who maybe aren't as gregarious or talkative or verbal in class. And how do I make sure I'm not kind of distancing myself from them, not in a malicious way, but because we cling to the things that are familiar, known, and safe to us. And so again, I've used this, and Beth says it was challenging, hard to define yourself. Yes, and this is, again, it's a challenging exercise, not only for you as an individual and as an adult learner, but then also if you choose to facilitate this type of exercise, which is one of the resources that we do have available for you all in conversation in classroom, we have some guiding prompts to guide the discussion, but getting comfortable with the exercise at first and then being able to talk about that experience with your students is one way that we've seen educators use this exercise to breed conversations and really understand their students better, to be more culturally relevant and responsive in your teaching settings. And so I'm going to wrap this part up. I really appreciate all of the chat and the engagement that you all have offered to us really graciously in the chat. I see the theme of anonymity opening up a lot and people feeling free and kind of at liberty to share in a more you know, anonymous way as one of the probably tips and practices. One additional piece that I will add to this, and this is just kind of, we'll send over these slides to you all later, but really we talk a lot about allyship and what does it take to serve as an ally. And there are 4 main components that were listed in a piece of research, focusing on belonging, recognizing the power that you own through these types of exercises of identity, making room for mistakes, creating that psychological safety, and then also being authentic, sharing your story, what's hard for you, what's challenging for you, because it provides permission for other folks to do so. We can probably skip that last slide, Ben, and I'm going to turn it back over to you to wrap this up.
Sure, thanks. And the last slide, again, this will be in the deck, but it's just some ideas for you can do from a monthly programming standpoint in your classroom. So this is a lot of information, amazing, just great feedback. Thank you, Jesse, and thanks everybody for the participation and openness and just being honest. So I mentioned earlier in the conversation that, or in the presentation, that we EVERFI create a lot of digital resources that you can have your students go through independently. So there is that anonymity component to it where they're learning about this content and they're able to reflect and learn individually. This slide is incredibly overwhelming. I'm very aware of this. I mentioned when I started that our initial focus is on financial education, and now we cover all these different areas, such as STEM and career exploration, social emotional learning, health and wellness, elementary academic readiness, and then diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are all student-driven, self-graded, standards-aligned resources that are not meant to take over your curriculum. They're a couple hours long in total each, and they're really designed to be something that will create time for you in the classroom. Awesome to see that Lily, you're working on the Mental Wellness Basics program. So we got some EVERFI users here. I'm going to go through briefly an overview for these 4 courses on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I'll show you how to sign up to use our programs. When you sign up, you're going to get access to everything. One thing I'll say about the grade levels you see, this doesn't mean that if you teach middle school, you don't have access to the 9th to 12th grade courses. And it doesn't mean if you're at high school that you can't use the elementary or middle school level of resources. Again, we're talking about meeting diverse learners. So you'll have access to everything regardless of the grade level you have. In the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have 4 programs. 2 that focus on African American history, 1 that focuses on general diversity foundations for high school. That's going to relate to something Jennifer mentioned earlier about having uncomfortable conversations. And then a new course we just launched called Building Insights to Navigate Anti-Semitism and Hate. So the first course I want to talk about is called 306 African American History. And this course consists of 15 lessons that are about 10 minutes each. Students are going to be able to pick and choose which ones they want to go through so you can align it to your curriculum guide, how you see fit. And the goal for this course is to teach students about different individuals, time periods, and events pertaining to African American history. So it's going to cover topics like the transatlantic slave trade, Underground Railroad, but it's also going to talk about pioneers such as Mae Jemison, who's the first African American astronaut. And it's going to talk about just different literary leaders during the Harlem Renaissance. It's a really great course, ideal fit for high school, but again, middle school students can use it as well. And it doesn't have to be social studies. This is just a guide in terms of where the suggested fit is. We have a lot of language arts or English teachers that use our programs for this, especially with Black History Month around the corner. Yep, and I just saw Ms. Drews, the hardest part about my job, I say this completely seriously, the hardest part about my job is convincing people that everything's free, and Sophia asked that as well. There is no cost for the resources that we're going to share with you. It's not limited by a length of period of time or for 30 kids. You're also going to get access to training and support. So my team and myself included in Illinois can do like, a school PD or et cetera. So yeah, just want to mention that free. It's the hardest part of my job is convincing people of that. And it's because we have partners that sponsor these programs for schools. So the significance of 306 really quickly. So just why is this course called 306 African American History? So the number 306 is really prevalent throughout African-American history. Just looking at the date of the Dred Scott decision, 306 was the room number in the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, where I used to teach, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Always requested, and then where he was assassinated as well. What the course kind of looks like from a student experience, it's very interactive and engaging. So students are gonna, for example, read texts like this from Frederick Douglass. There's prompts in here where it's going to highlight key bolded terms. So this is a great course for social studies or English or language arts teachers to help engage students around these topics and individuals such as Frederick Douglass. There's pre and post assessments built into the course, so you're getting data and feedback as well on what the students are going through while they use the programs. And thanks, Jay Gillespie, for saying use it for years, never cost a dime. It's all sponsored. Yep. There's going to be interactive maps while students go through the course. So they're not just reading and answering questions. It's going to be engaging for them. There's also audio built into the program and closed captioning text as well. So that can be really helpful for students as well. At the end of the course, there's a capstone essay that's completely optional. So it's just a way for students to take what they've learned and reflect on some of the topic areas. Could be a great assignment around Black History Month. I'm also going to talk to you about a scholarship opportunity that we have, a few of them actually, where students can basically use this capstone essay as a scholarship application. And that's for students of all grade levels. We actually just yesterday, or sorry, on Monday, we launched a continuation of the 306 course. So this one's called 306 Continuing the Story. And what we wanted to make sure that we were doing was taking some of the topics that have come up in the past few decades or sometimes even in 2020 and connect those to the story that we have around educating students around African-American history. So 306 Continuing the Story's goal is to really inspire today's students by telling stories about the Black experience in the United States, elevating history as a lens to understand current events. Students are gonna, in this course, draw connections between shaping historical events across the Civil Rights era to modern day events so they can better understand the experiences of Black people in the United States. Alongside that, there's an understanding that the Black experience is not monolithic, but more nuanced and varied based off of a lot of different factors covered in the course. So the goal for the course really is to inform and inspire and empower and elevate. And I'm just going through this quickly so I can make sure there's time to show you how to register and sign up and ask questions at the end. I'm going to show a really quick demonstration for what the course looks and feels like from a student's perspective. Bear with me for 1 second. I'm just going to share my screen. Jesse, can you give me a confirmation? Do you see the screen with the student?
Yeah.
Okay. So when students start any of our courses, there's an introduction that's going to tell them
the hardships imposed upon Black people. This course, introduction. This course provides lessons related to the culture and history of Black people in the United States. It covers some of the remarkable accomplishments and contributions from Black people, as well as various instances of the systemic racism they experience.
So all the courses start off providing a framework for what the students are going to be learning about. So it's really helpful there just to set the stage for what they're going to be going through. There's a pre-assessment, so students don't need to have any prerequisite knowledge while they're going through our lessons. This is an example of one of the pre-assessment questions for the 306 continuing story course, where they're going to get asked a question about Juneteenth. Then they're going to go through the course, learn about the content covered there, and then they get assessed at the end. As an educator, you're going to be able to see the pre and post assessment scores, so you can see what the knowledge gains are for the students who went through it. Let me just jump off and share this. Okay, so there's 4 lessons for this particular course. It's available in Spanish. I saw some teachers in here that speak Spanish earlier. And again, 4 lessons. They're about 15 minutes each total. So this entire course is probably going to take about an hour for students to go through. And then there's a lot of offline materials that I'll go through as well.
And there was a question about it linking to Google Classroom.
I'm going to share, Demetrius, some instructions for registration that I'll go over, and we can integrate with like single sign-on, so we can integrate with Clever, and there's instructions for Google Classroom as well. Really briefly, these are some video interviewees that are featured in the course, and also one of our subject matter experts, Patrice McLaurin, who helped us work on this as well. There's information here about a scholarship. So for any completion of any EVERFI course, students can enter in like an essay reflecting on what they've learned to earn a $1,000 529 savings plan scholarship. For Illinois high school seniors, Regions Bank, one of our partners, offers a $5,000 scholarship only for high school seniors. It has no contingency requirements to complete an EVERFI course. It's all students have to do is really write a reflection essay about an African American who inspires them. The links will be provided in this presentation. The link for the Regions Bank one, it's not available yet. It will be ready sometime in February. So right now the link is outdated, but I wanted to make sure that this was available to you all for those of you who have high school seniors. And again, there's no EVERFI completion for courses required here. Jumping back to another course, again, Jennifer, you talked about having uncomfortable conversations with students and that being something that's really important. So we launched a course that's called Diversity Foundations for High School. The goal for this course is to teach students about the importance of ally behavior, which was something we discussed earlier, self-care, creating a more inclusive environment. It's going to go over topics to being actively listening, power, privilege, and oppression, identities and influence. 5 lessons, about 20 minutes each. And again, you can space these out over time. You don't have to do them all in one setting. I'm going to go through these quickly, but there's one particular lesson, again, thinking about Jennifer, what you mentioned earlier, in terms of having difficult conversations. So there's a lesson here on like a communication workshop where it's designed to really help students with communication skills on topics that can be uncomfortable, specifically around topics related to identity and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the last resource I want to talk about is called BINA, Building Insights to Navigate Anti-Semitism and Hate. 4 lessons, about 15 minutes long, really designed to help raise awareness about the topics related to this. It touches on allyship, gets into discrimination. It's not strictly dedicated to talking about anti-Semitism, because it also gets into topics like redlining, which is something that impacts a lot of different minority groups as well, and people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, I should say. This is a lot of information that I just threw in, and it's because I really want to make sure that we have time to show you how to register and go through the process for how to sign up for our courses. Are there any questions about any of the content covered? I saw a lot of people chiming in about the programs they already use. Okay. I'm going to go through, Olga, the navigation process and how to get signed up really quickly. I'm not going to cover it here just for the sake of time, but we have some different teaching guides that are connected to our courses. So there's, for our Diversity Foundations course, we have a facilitator guide. It goes over like external lesson plans and a course outline and just things you can do to help have a blended learning experience with the course. And then there's also an anti-racism teaching guide. So this is going to provide some self-paced professional development, reading, videos, activities, just even more as if you didn't have enough for resources that you can use in extension to the online materials. I want to show you how to get access to our programs, but related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, part of that is having ways to promote an inclusive classroom. A lot of people are talking about social emotional learning and resources they use related to that. I saw Whitney uses one. We have programs that cover social emotional learning at all grade levels for elementary, middle, and high school that you can use too. Directly covers some of the topics here that we covered as well. All right, access. And again, I apologize for the speed of doing this, but this is, for those of you who are familiar with EVERFI, this is going to be a little bit repetitive, but there's some extra new programs. There's some new programs and things that we have to share. So I want to show you first what the teacher dashboard looks like. So when you get access to our programs, this is like your teacher dashboard. A couple things. There's a button that says resources, and the resources button is going to show you an example of some of our external resources, or the standards alignment guide, or a teacher facilitator guide, the offline, the answer questions for the post assessments. So sometimes there's parent discussion guides around the topics that we're covering. You also have the ability to view course. So if you're curious how to gain access from a student's perspective, that's available for you. And there's also a course catalog here. So once you sign up for one course, you can go to the catalog and view everything else that we have as well. So it's broken down by our verticals for financial education, social emotional learning, health and wellness, college and career readiness. You would add the courses to your dashboard, and then it will look how this looks over here in terms of having all the different courses outlined. To create a class, which is the way to really get students started, you would click on this button that says create class. And I'm just going to call this block 1. And I'm going to start in February with my class. You choose the size, the grade level, and I'm going to click add courses. What this will do is this will bundle or package the courses kind of together. So if I want my block 1 to have these 3 or 4 courses, I'm going to add them all. Click here, and then I'm going to click create. And Charles, I see your question. Yep, I'm going to help you out with that. And what it's going to do is give you a code. Now the students are going to use this code to sign up. And when I give them this one code, which will be emailed to you as well when you create a class, it will give students access to all of these programs. So right there, it was pretty easy in terms of ways to create a class and give students access to a lot of information. How do you make the courses together to have the same code? Charles, what you would do is create a class and then, name it test. And then you see this button down here, which will let you, I'm going to show you in a second, Kathy, the website to go to. And once you add them here, you click add, and it will give them those 3 courses here. And then you click create. Oh, start date, sorry, February, number of students. And then create, and it'll give you that code. If you've already made a class, C#, you can edit and then add more if you'd like. So on the dashboard, there's the ability to create a class, view the course, look at the additional resources. There's a reports button, which is going to show you the grades. So this is going to tell you how the students did on a specific lesson. For the transatlantic slave trade, I got an 80 on my post assessment. It'll tell you if they're certified. That means they've completed all of the lessons with a passing grade. And this is just a breakdown for how the students are doing on the assessments. It will save their progress. So if they don't finish, it'll bring them back to where they were when they left off the next time they come in. I'm going to pause for a second and put the go through the registration process. And then I see a bunch of questions coming in. I'll address those for sure. To register, you would go to this website, and instructions are going to be on the presentation. EVERFI.net. and you're going to click this register button. You're going to click on K through 12 teacher and search for the school that you're in. Where am I teaching? Missy Taylor's here, so I'm teaching in Belleville. All right, just since Missy's on the line. Let's see, Belleville High School East. I'm going to click next, and then it's going to ask you to create a username and password and choose any of our courses. Once you choose one, it will bring you here and you can add others. So I'm going to post the instructions on the slide here so you can see, and then I'm going to address a bunch of the questions that were in the chat. You will get a recording of the webinar. I'm going to chat it in a second. Ms. Drews asked if they do not pass, will they have access to retake the courses? Yes, if a student does not pass the lessons, they can retake it. It'll also tell the students, or it'll also tell the teachers how many times the students took the course, the test again. Have you created a school user admin console? Liz asks, so that there's one admin who can create and manage all schools' logins across the years. We actually, we have something that will show the administrators what teachers are using what programs in the district. We're FERPA compliant. So when thinking about managing logins, being FERPA compliant just restricts us from being able to save data. We don't share any data. Again, that's a FERPA compliancy issue. So we're not able to save things over like the course of years and give one administrator access to a lot of different accounts. But we do have a way for administrators to have an account where they can see who's using in their particular school or district. Jody asked, Olga, to clarify, you have to create a class every time you add a course. No, Olga, what you would do is on this page, once you sign up, go to your catalog and add all of the courses that you want. And when you create a class, what you do is there's an add courses button at the bottom and you choose the different ones you want the students to have access to. And when you click add, it will show that this block 2 is getting all these courses. And the instructions are going to be shared as well in the presentation. Other questions around registration? I'm going to jump through this. I'm going to chat in the presentation actually right now, and also a way to book a meeting with me as well. So you can have access to do that if you want like a refresher or instructions. I think it wasn't Dion, who was it that asked about Google Classrooms? There's a couple ways that students can register. There's the way I showed you, the traditional way. There's a way to upload your students using a CSV file. And then there's single sign-on instructions. I'm also going to share in the document that I'll show you in a second. It will have instructions for Google Classroom as well. 1 second. Really cool for those of you who are active EVERFI teachers. We have a referral program. So it's on the top of your page when you sign in, there's a button that says invite a teacher. Click there if you have educators who you know who might use this program. Even if they're not in your school or in your district or state, you can still fill this out, put in their email address, the course you think they might like. If they start using and they're new to our system, you'll receive a $15 Amazon gift card. There's no limit on that as well. So refer away. And my coworker is prompting me, make sure you let them know that we can do these PDs for you as well. Jessie can't join all of them, unfortunately. She's fantastic, but I can't take her time. But I just put in the chat a link to the presentation. And also there's a link to book a meeting with me if you'd like to chat about this further as well. Okay, questions and answers. Let's think if there's if you give me an Amazon gift card, I might join you. Oh, Jessie's going to join every time, for every presentation she gets. It's definitely worth the $15 incentive, Jessie. Any questions and answers that maybe weren't addressed? I'm going to go through the chat and see if there's anything that I maybe missed. In the presentation that I shared, I hope people are able to access it. Yep, I see a bunch of people signing on. There's a document, we call this a one-stop shop, and it has everything you would basically need. Contact information, documents on how to get started. I forget who the individual was. Somebody asked about the length of period of time for all the courses. That's in the course outline. It's going to tell you how long each course costs or goes through. I saw, what is the cost for the PD? There is no cost for anything except I have to pay Jessie $15 if I can convince her to join me for some. But no, Michelle, I can do this training myself or my team in Illinois. They're all listening and they're on this presentation. We can do this presentation. We can share our resources, whether it's one-on-one or as a group. I do not kid when I say call, text, email me whenever you want. My phone number is also listed in this presentation. So, oh wait, if you refresh, sorry, I think I forgot to add it at the top of the slide. But my information is available. If you go to like slide number 2 of the presentation, it's up top. My link, again, for booking a meeting. If you have any questions or want help, please just click on that, set up a time to chat with me or email me, and we can go from there. Other things, I think the PD hours, Amber, I think that gets sent out to, I think IDEA addresses that, right?
Yes, we will put it in the chat, and I'm not sure if there is there any more slides after that one, Ben?
Yeah, there's 2 slides after this. I'll pass this over to you for now.
Okay, thank you. So if you're interested, we're having another Wednesday webinar next week. We will have with Carrie Moulton. She'll be talking about Google Slides Beyond. And if you want to go to the next one, Ben, thank you, Charles, for the shout out in the chat about IdeaCon. We would love to have you join us for IdeaCon as well. We are having a full month, February 1st through 24th. Of live sessions, on-demand sessions that will be recorded that you can watch through March, and lots of fun new activities, including a virtual race, if that's something that you'll be interested in. You can check that out. Jenna has put the PDH's links into the Google chat, so please check the chat for the 1.5 hours of professional development hours for today, and those will auto send you the evidence of completion that you need. A big, huge thank you to Jesse and Ben and the EVERFI team who was monitoring the chat today for their time. Incredible, timely, and much appreciated conversations and discussions in the chat as well. Thank you all so much for joining us. And I will hand it over to Ben to make sure he finalizes any additional questions that were in the chat. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Yeah, and one other thing, thank you, Amber, for doing this. If this is your first time being exposed to IDEA, like check out their website. They offer a lot of virtual PD, which is really helpful, especially now when there's no in-person professional development you can do. I'm going to link again. I just saw somebody asked for the presentation. I think that was Maria. I will say again, please bother me, call, text, email me, and I will set up trainings for your school or for your district or for your PLC group. You say jump, we say how high. Our job is to really work to help provide you with these resources and really raise awareness about these critical topics with students. And yeah, somebody privately, E. Hopkins, you DM'd me. I will respond to you if you're still listening.